In this segment, we're going to look at how to solve a quadratic equation using what's called the square root property. Now, before we actually work with the square root property on this given equation, I'd like us to remember what the square root property helps us to do when we have a simpler quadratic equation to solve. In fact, this one is what's called a pure quadratic because it has our x, our variable, to the second power, and then I don't have an x to the first power term, but then after that I just have a number on the other side. So when I just have the x squared term, but no x to the first or other powers of x, I have a pure quadratic. Well, to solve a pure quadratic equation, we can use something called the square root property by realizing that if I want to find the value of x, that when I square that number, I would get 81. I could just undo the operation of the square by taking the square root of both sides. So if I take the square root of my x squared, and then also the square root of my number on the other side, 81. Now, I also have to allow for both the positive case and the negative case, because I know that when I take a number and square it, a positive number squared is positive, and a negative number quantity squared is also positive. So I can have two different solutions to this. Well, the square root of x squared, we have x is equal to 81 is a perfect square number, so the square root of 81 is 9, so I'll get either a positive 9 or a negative 9. And I can write that as plus or minus 9, or I can write them out separately to show both solutions. X is equal to 9, or x is equal to negative 9. So that's an example of our square root property when we have a very easy pure quadratic equation to solve. Now let's come over and look at the quadratic equation that's in this example. It says to solve 2 times the quantity x minus 3 squared minus 10 is equal to 0. And we want to use the square root property. Now it's a good property to use for this question because the variable that we're trying to solve for is in the parentheses that's quantity squared, and there's no x that's outside that parenthesis squared in another term. So if I could just get this expression where it's the x minus 3 quantity squared isolated on a side by itself, then I could go ahead and use that square root property to get the square off the quantity and then finish off to solve for my x. So we'll start by taking our 2 times the quantity, x minus 3 squared minus 10 is equal to 0. And I want to isolate this x minus 3 quantity squared. So first I need to isolate the term that includes that quantity. So we're going to add 10 to both sides. And I have 2 times the quantity, x minus 3 squared is equal to 10. Then we need to undo the multiplication of 2 that's on the outside of the parentheses by dividing both sides by 2. And we'll get x minus 3 quantity squared is equal to 5. And now you see that I have that quantity that's squared is isolated on the left side, equal to, and then whatever we had on the other side. And we're ready to undo the process of the squaring by taking the square root of both sides. So we'll take the square root of both sides, remembering to put down the positive or negative option. On the left-hand side, the square root will undo this process of square, so we'll just have x minus 3. And on the right-hand side, 5 is not a perfect square number, nor does it have any perfect square factors in it. So we're just going to write that as the irrational number plus or minus the square root of 5, giving both of the irrational numbers there. And to finally then solve for x, we'll just add 3 to both sides. So we'll have x is equal to, adding 3 to both sides, plus or minus the square root of 5, and then stop your radical there, and then plus 3. Now, these are not like terms, because 3 does not have a square root of 5 on it, and this term is the square root of 3. But we could get into a little dangerous situation with having the square root and then other terms after it in case we just got a little sloppy and made our radical too long. So we're best off writing this where we take and rearrange the terms. And remember, if you rearrange terms, you take the sign that's in front of it with it when you rearrange it. So we're going to write this as x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 5 for the final solution of that quadratic equation using the square root property.